So you have already seen this, that even though the user was authenticated, it was not able to even list the pods or get the pods, because it says that the user, K8s user, does not have access because it cannot list resource in the namespace prod. I told you earlier that authentication is just a way to enter the system, and once you are in the system, you need authorization to have access to the resources in the system. So that's why we're getting this error. Now to fix this, we have to use authorization, and in Kubernetes we get it using RBAC, or role-based access control. So we have this cluster and the API server, and we have authenticated the API server, so the user is authenticated. Now to access the resources in the cluster, it has to go through the authorization layer, which is provided by RBAC. Now once you're authorized, then this authenticated user can create pods, deployments or services, can delete pods, deployments and services, and any other actions whatsoever. There are two objects that are used collectively to provide authorization. The first one is roles and the second one is role binding. Now these two combined together collectively provides authorization in Kubernetes. Now what is roles? It's a collection of permission on resources. So we have this role, we mention all the things that this role can do, like get a pod, list pods, create pods, delete services, etc. And on what resources these actions or verbs are allowed. So it is a collection of verbs or actions that you want to do on the resources. So you mention both the actions or verbs and the resources as well. And this is how the manifest file of a role looks like. Notice the API version. It is rbac.authorization.k8s.io/v1. It's pretty different than v1 or apps/v1. The kind is of course role. In the metadata we mention the name of the role, and in rules we mention resources, verbs, and something called API groups. Don't worry about API groups as of now. You can keep it blank as is. But in resources, we mention that what resources we want to allow the actions or verbs to. So in this case, the resources is pods and the verbs are get, watch, and list. In fact, I can remove watch. Let's say get and list. So this is what a role is. This is the simplest form of role, and you can have multiple rules. As you can see, the rule is an array. So you can add one more rule with another resource. So let's say we add one more rule with resource service, and then you say verb only get, so you cannot create or delete, so on and so forth. So you can have multiple rules in the same role. Now this is only the association of permissions with the resources, but we have not attached or we have not given these permissions to any user. So that is where role binding comes into picture. So using role binding, we bind the user with the role. So the role mentions the permission along with the resources, and role binding mentions the users or groups. So let's say we have this authenticated user, and this is the role which has all these permissions or all these actions on all these resources. And role binding is used to put them together. So after you create role binding, then only the user will have access to the role, which is a set of permissions. So let's see here, the API version is again rbac.authorization.k8s.io/v1. The kind is role binding. In metadata, provide the name, and it's a little confusing because we have subjects here. In the previous one, we had rules, but in role binding, we have subjects, and there are two things in subjects. Now in subjects, we mention kind. It can be a user or a group or something called service account, which we have not discussed yet. Now in this case, I'm saying that it's a user, and the name of the user is K8s user, and there's something called API group. Again, keep it as is. You do not have to bother about it. Just mention rbac.authorization.k8s.io. And as you can see, subject can be an array. So you can use a single role binding to associate single role with multiple users or groups. So in this case, I'm binding or attaching this role to this user, which is K8s user. So after subjects, we mention role reference, and here the kind is of course role, and the name is KTS user role, which is nothing but the name of the role that we created in the previous slide. And API group says as is, don't change it. So after this is done, we associate the user with the permission which is there in the role. So let's go ahead and see a demo. We'll provide access to KTS user so that it can create, get and list pods. And then we'll provide additional access to KTS user to delete pods. Right now, as you can see, this user does not have any access, and I'm using KTS user because this is the kubeconfig file that we have just created, and it has been created for KTS user. The name of the user is KTS user. Okay, so now let us go ahead and create a role and a role binding. So for that, we have to go to the master server. We are in master server, and I have this file KTSUser.role. Now it is very simple. I'm saying that the API version is again rbac.authorization.kts.io/v1. The kind is role, metadata is the name, and in rules I'm mentioning get list, and I have to add one more, which is create. And the resources is of course pods. Let us go ahead and create the role. And one more thing is that role is scoped to a namespace, just like any other resource, but users are not. So I'll create this role in prod namespace. It has been created. Now one more thing is that I'll have to create the role binding. And in the role binding, I have mentioned the subject to be a user, and the name of the user is KTS user, and the role reference is KTS user role. Let us go ahead and create this. And this is also scoped to a namespace, and I'll mention the namespace to be prod. Sorry, I should mention kubectl, and it has been created. If you want to see, you can do kubectl get role provided with the namespace, and similarly kubectl get role binding. Okay, it was not created, sorry, there was some error. Exactly one of cluster role or role must be specified. I have not discussed cluster role yet. Okay, the error was that I had mentioned role binding and then the name of the role, so I should mention only create-f KTS role binding. It's a very stupid error, but anyway, both of them has been created. If you do get roles, we can see the roles, and so can we see the role binding. And now the user KTS user has been associated with the permissions which are there in the role. And I'm in the cluster machine again. If I execute this command, I should be able to see the pods in the prod namespace, and there you go, I can see it. So these are the pods that are running. Can I see the deployments? The answer is no, because we have not given access to deployments. So it says forbidden. Neither can we see the pods in the default namespace because we have not given any permission. As I said, the roles are scoped to namespace. What I'll do is that I'll change the role.yml file, and in that file I'll add the resource deployments also. So I have changed the file and I'll have to apply it. So it has been associated again. Now let's go ahead and see in the client machine. Can I see the deployments? Sorry, the API group should be apps. Let me add the deployments, and in deployments the API group should be apps rather than simple space, and in resources I'll mention deployments, and in verbs I'll mention get and list. That's it. And also let me add a permission to delete the pod, to delete any pod rather. Alright, so let me apply the file again. So it has been configured. If I go to client machine, and if I do get deployments, I can see the deployments in prod namespace, but the same thing would not be true for default namespace. As you can see, I'm forbidden. Now can I delete the pods? The answer is yes. So let's go ahead and delete one of the pods. Sorry, I'll have to mention the kubeconfig, and the pod has been deleted. But if I try to do it in the default namespace, I'll not be able to do so. Let's try it in default namespace. And in fact, I can't even see anything in default namespace. So this is how you provide authorization using RBAC. So we have just scratched the surfaces. There are a few more things that I want to discuss. I have not talked about cluster role and I have not talked about service accounts. So let's go ahead and see what those things are.